in the fog-draped hollows of Appalachia. There are families who are never supposed to exist. They appear in census records as free persons of color, yet their skin is pale, their eyes blue or gray, and their accents thick with mountain twang. They built churches, farmed hillsides, and buried their dead, but officially no one knew who they were. Locals called them Melungeons, a word whispered more often than spoken. For centuries, they lived on the margins of society, occupying a strange legal and social limbo. Not white, not black, not native, just something else. Children were warned not to marry them. Churches denied them pews. Schools quietly kept their distance. Yet the Melungeons persisted, tucked into the ridges of Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky, forming communities that survived through isolation and loyalty. They called themselves Collins, Goins, Gibson, Bunch, Mullins, and Bolin, names that sounded English or Scots, not mysterious at all. But here's the paradox. Their physical features didn't match the label society gave them. Many Melungeon families had straight black hair, olive skin, and high cheekbones. Some had red hair and green eyes. Others had darker complexions that baffled census takers who tried to force them into rigid racial boxes. Where did they come from? Early historians proposed wild theories. Some claimed they were descendant of Portuguese sailors shipwrecked on the Carolina coast. Others insisted they were Turks, Moors, or even survivors of Sir Walter Raleigh's lost colony. One popular rumor said they were mixed descendants of Native Americans and runaway African slaves. But another theory, far more dangerous in its implications, began to circulate quietly among Appalachian elders. What if the Melungeons weren't foreigners at all? What if they were Scots? Not just any Scots, but survivors of one of the most violent ethnic purges in British history. In the early 1700s, thousands of Highland Scots were forcibly removed from their lands after the Jacobite rebellions failed. Families were burned out, exiled, or shipped across the Atlantic as indentured servants. Many arrived in the American colonies with no records, no protection, and no identity beyond their clans. Now imagine those displaced Scots, many of them already mixed with native or Iberian blood from centuries of Atlantic trade, being dumped into the Appalachian frontier, where law barely existed. Would they survive by blending in? Would they hide? Would they reinvent themselves? Melungeon oral histories speak of ancestors who arrived by ship, who spoke strange languages, who were forced into mountains to escape persecution. Some families even preserve fragments of old-world stories about clan feuds, burned villages, and lost homelands. But mainstream history dismissed these accounts as fantasy. Yet DNA would later tell a different story. What was buried in the blood of the Melungeons would shock geneticists and reopen one of the greatest forgotten chapters of American settlement, because Appalachia may not have just been a frontier. It may have been a refuge for a shattered Scottish clan that history tried to erase. And the mountains kept their secret. To understand the Melungeons, we must first travel back, not to America, but to the blood-soaked Highlands of Scotland. In the 1600s and early 1700s, Scotland was not a peaceful land of bagpipes and castles. It was a fractured nation torn apart by clan warfare, English domination, and rebellion. The Highland clans lived under their own laws, spoke their own languages, and pledged loyalty not to kings, but to bloodlines. One of those clans was quietly powerful, highly mobile, and deeply mistrusted by both the English crown and lowland Scots. The Clan Macaulay, sometimes spelled Macaulay or Macaulay. They were known as borderland people living between worlds. Some histories suggest they had Norse blood. Others say they descended from ancient Gaelic warriors. What's clear is that they were not fully welcome anywhere. They were often accused of being mixed outsiders, and even dark feature compared to other Scots. When the Jacobite uprisings erupted, attempts to restore the Catholic Stuart kings to the throne, the Highland clans paid the price. After the disastrous Battle of Culloden in 1746, British forces systematically destroyed Highland culture. They banned tartans. They outlawed clan gatherings. They confiscated land. And thousands of Scots were either executed, imprisoned, or forcibly shipped overseas. Some were sent to the Caribbean as slaves. Others were sold as indentured servants to the American colonies. Records show entire ships full of Highlanders arriving in Virginia, the Carolinas, and Pennsylvania, many listed only as Scotch servants. No clan, no family, no future. But here's where things get strange. Some of those Scots vanished from the records almost immediately. No farms, no wills, no church documents. They didn't integrate into established Scottish American communities. Instead, they fled into the interior, toward the wildest, least governed territory on the continent, Appalachia. That land was already occupied by Cherokee, Shawnee, and other native tribes, but it was also full of deep valleys where no government could follow. And that's exactly where Melungeon communities would later appear. Even more unsettling, many Melungeon surnames, Collins, Mullins, Gibson, Kennedy, Goins, trace directly to Scottish and Irish border clans. The name Goins, for example, may come from Gowans, a Scottish clan name. Mullins can derive from McMullen. Collins appears in both Irish and Scottish Highland records. But unlike most Scots in America, Melungeons had no written family trees, no preserved genealogy, no homeland stories beyond whispered fragments. Why? Because their ancestors may have been refugees hiding their identity. In a world where Highland Scots were hunted, labeled traitors, and punished by the crown, survival meant becoming invisible. So they changed. They married outside their group. They blended. They became something new. And in doing so, they created a people who would spend the next 300 years being told they didn't belong anywhere. But blood remembers what history tries to erase. For centuries, the Melungeons were treated as a mystery too messy for real history. But in the late 20th century, science did what rumor never could. It opened their blood. When geneticists began testing Melungeon descendants, they expected to find what most historians had claimed, a blend of Native American and African ancestry. But that's not what appeared. Instead, something startling emerged. A large number of Melungeon men carried Y-DNA haplogroups common in Scotland, Ireland, and northern England, especially markers linked to Highland and border clans. Some were almost identical to genetic signatures found today in western Scotland. Even more shocking, several Melungeon families tested positive for Iberian and Mediterranean markers, especially Portuguese and Spanish. This combination, Scottish and Iberian, was extremely rare in early colonial America, unless your ancestors had already been mixed before they ever reached the New World. Scottish ports like Glasgow and Inverness were deeply connected to Atlantic trade routes. Sailors, mercenaries, and refugees often moved between Scotland, Portugal, Spain, and North Africa. Some Highland clans had Iberian blood going back centuries. When these mixed Highlanders were deported or fled to America, they arrived already racially ambiguous. In a rigid, race-obsessed colonial society, that was dangerous, so they vanished. Melungeon DNA also showed something else. Almost no Native American ancestry. Almost no sub-Saharan African ancestry. The very labels used to discriminate against them were scientifically false. They were not triracial. They were European, but not acceptable Europeans. Scots who did not fit the English idea of whiteness. This explains something chilling. In the American colonies, Highland Scots were often treated almost as a separate race. British propaganda described them as barbaric, violent, and dark. After the Jacobite rebellions, many colonists distrusted them deeply. So when these refugees reached Appalachia, they were not welcomed. They were feared. And when people fear you, they invent stories about you. Melungeons became other, something in between. A people no one had to grant full humanity. That identity, neither white nor black nor native, was imposed on them, not chosen. And once the label existed, it became impossible to escape. Even when Melungeons tried to pass as white, neighbors remembered. Even when they served in wars, suspicion followed. Even when DNA proved their ancestry, the myth had already taken root. But the genetic evidence is clear. Many Melungeon families descend from a population of displaced Scots and Iberians who entered America without records and settled where no one could find them, in the Appalachian Mountains. They weren't hiding because they were ashamed. They were hiding because the world was hunting them. Appalachia is not just a place. It is a fortress. Rugged ridges, fog-filled hollows, narrow valleys, and forests so thick that even sunlight struggles to penetrate. In the 1700s and 1800s, It was one of the least governable regions in North America. That's exactly why the Melungeons chose it, or were driven into it. Settlers who didn't fit into colonial society, runaways, deserters, refugees, and the unwanted, fled Appalachia because it offered something no city could: anonymity. Melungeon communities formed on land no one else wanted. Rocky soil, steep hills, places no plantation owner would bother with. They built cabins, churches, and schools with their own hands. They married within their own group. They protected their own, and they stayed out of sight. Yet even in isolation, prejudice followed. Local governments labeled them free people of color, even when they were not. This stripped them of voting rights, land ownership, and legal protection. Children were denied schooling. Adults were denied the courts. They were not enslaved, but they were not free. Melungeon families learned that survival meant staying quiet, speaking softly, not drawing attention, passing when possible. Some changed their names. Some moved again. Some intermarried with whites to dilute the stigma. Others refused and paid the price. Churches split over whether Melungeons could sit in white pews. Graveyards were segregated. In some counties, Melungeon families were banned from public life entirely. Yet despite this, their culture endured. They kept old songs, some with melodies eerily similar to Scottish ballads. They told stories of ancestors crossing oceans, fleeing wars, hiding in mountains. They practiced herbal medicine rooted in European folk traditions, and they clung to family. Clan loyalty mattered. Blood mattered. If you were Melungeon, you belonged to something ancient, even if you didn't know what it was. The outside world saw them as backward, suspicious, and inferior. But in truth, they were the descendants of people who had already survived one ethnic cleansing and refused to be erased by another. Appalachia became their shield. The mountains hid them from government, from persecution, and from history itself. But hiding has a cost. When you disappear, you also lose your story. By the 20th century, even Melungeon descendants no longer knew where they came from. They only knew they were different, and that difference had hurt them. And yet, buried beneath that pain was something extraordinary. A lineage of Highland exiles, a clan without a homeland, waiting to be remembered. One of the strangest things about the Melungeons is that their names were never mysterious. They sounded completely ordinary. Collins, Gibson, Kennedy, Mullins, Bunch, Goins. But when researchers began tracing these surnames backward, something unexpected appeared. They didn't lead to native tribes. They didn't lead to Africa. They led to Scotland, Ireland, and the English-Scottish borderlands. Take the name Kennedy. It originates from the Gaelic Sine-Eye, meaning ugly head or helmeted warrior. The Kennedy clan was deeply involved in Scottish and Irish conflicts for centuries. The name Gibson comes from son of Gilbert, common among Scottish border families. Mullins links to the Gaelic McMullen. Goins may trace to Gowans or McGowan, an old Highland surname. These are not random. They are clan names, and they are the same names that appear again and again in Melungeon family trees. But there's another layer. Some Melungeon families carried Mediterranean genetic markers alongside their Scottish ones. This aligns a little-known historical fact. Scottish ports were heavily involved in Iberian trade, piracy, and military service. Scottish mercenaries fought in Spain and Portugal. Scottish sailors married Iberian women. Scottish refugees fled through Mediterranean ports. By the time these Highlanders were deported or escaped to America, many already had darker complexions and mixed blood. In a British-controlled world obsessed with racial purity, this made them dangerous. So when they arrived in the colonies, they were immediately marked as other. Census takers didn't know what to call them, so they chose the most damaging label possible: non-white. From that moment on, their fate was sealed. The Melungeon identity wasn't created by the people themselves. It was created by paperwork, a bureaucratic invention that stripped Highland refugees of their European identity and placed them outside the law. Over time, the stigma became self-perpetuating. Once labeled, families were forced into isolation. Once isolated, they intermarried. Once they intermarried, outsiders saw them as proof of their own prejudice. a closed loop of discrimination. Yet inside those communities, clan memory never fully died. Family elders spoke of being Scotch. Some said Portuguese. Others said simply, "We're not what they say." They knew something had been stolen from them. They just didn't know what. It would take DNA historians and Melungeon descendants reclaiming their heritage to finally piece it together. They were not a lost race. They were a lost clan. Every mystery has a motive. Why would the story of the Melungeons be buried so deeply? The answer is uncomfortable, because it exposes something America doesn't like to admit, that some of its earliest settlers were not free pioneers, but ethnic refugees, stripped of identity by imperial violence. The British Empire did not just conquer land, it erased cultures. Highland Scots were among its first victims. After Culloden, they were treated almost as a conquered race. Their language was suppressed. Their clothing was banned. Their land was stolen. Their children were taken. And when they were shipped to America, they were not welcomed as equals. They were dumped, labeled, and forgotten. If the Melungeons are indeed descended from those Highland exiles, it means Appalachia was not just settled. It was used as a dumping ground for unwanted people. And that truth threatens the romantic myth of American origins. It's easier to say the Melungeons were mysterious others than to admit they were Europeans deliberately stripped of whiteness to make them easier to control. This is why their story vanished. It disrupts the clean narrative of colonists and natives. It reveals a third category, the erased. Today, Melungeon descendants are reclaiming their identity. They are finding Scottish, Irish, and Iberian roots. They are rebuilding what was stolen. But history doesn't get back easily. The mountains kept the secret. The blood preserved it. And now, at last, the Melungeons are speaking. One of the most powerful pieces of evidence for the Scottish clan theory doesn't come from laboratories. It comes from stories. Melungeon families have passed down oral histories for generations. Stories that make no sense if they were native or African in origin, but make perfect sense if they were Highland refugees. Elders spoke of ancestors who crossed the ocean, not as slaves, but as prisoners or exiles. They spoke of burned villages, lost lands, and soldiers hunting their people. They told of fleeing into mountains to survive. That isn't Native American history. That isn't African American history. That is Scottish Highland history. Some Melungeon families even preserve fragments of old songs and sayings that linguists later found had roots in Gaelic and Scots-Irish dialects. The rhythm, the structure, the phrasing, it wasn't coincidence. It was cultural memory. Even certain Melungeon funeral customs and herbal practices match traditions found in the Scottish Highlands, not in African or native cultures. For 300 years, people dismissed these stories as fantasy. But now, when paired with DNA and surnames, they form a chilling pattern. A people knew who they were. The world refused to listen. Being Melungeon didn't just mean being mysterious. It meant being targeted. Children were bullied. Families were denied jobs. People were told they were not fit to marry real Americans. All because of a lie. Even into the 20th century, Melungeon descendants hid their identity to survive. Some moved away. Some passed as white. Some cut ties with their own families. That is what historical erasure looks like. Not just forgotten, but forced. Yet now that silence is breaking. People are taking DNA tests. They are rediscovering clans. They are reclaiming a history that was stolen. And Appalachia is finally being seen not just as poor, but as powerful, a refuge. If the Melungeon story is true, then Appalachia holds one of the greatest hidden migrations in American history. A Scottish clan, possibly several, escaped genocide, crossed an ocean, and rebuilt itself in the wilderness, not as conquerors, but as survivors. They didn't write books. They didn't build monuments. They built families. And that may be the strongest legacy of all. Today, the Melungeons are no longer invisible. They are not a myth. They are not a mystery. They are people whose story was stolen and is finally being returned. Beyond the Melungeons lies something even deeper, a forgotten Scotland, hidden in the American mountains, and waiting to be remembered. If you believe history should never be buried, Subscribe to the Crit Stories and uncover forgotten truths the world tried to erase.